Yes, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this workshop uh, entitled The Whole Truth About America's Monetary System. And as Carolyn said, I'm from the Philadelphia Ethical Society. I'm also a member of the Assembly Planning Committee. And it's in that capacity that I have the honor of introducing our speakers for tonight. Uh, Walt McCree is the Emeritus Chair and Senior Advisor of the Public Banking Institute, where he has held leadership roles since the inception of the organization. He co-founded and helped direct other public banking initiatives, including the Pennsylvania Project and Banking on New Jersey. Walt produces and co-hosts the radio podcast, It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. And he hosts the Public Bank Solution online TV series. Walt has served as president of Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy of public banking experts, helping legislators and policy professionals address the creation of their own public banks. He has held leadership positions in a variety of public interest issues, including world hunger, the environment, public broadcasting, and the arts. He holds a BA in philosophy and geography from Valparaiso University. Ellen Brown is the founder and chair of the Public Banking Institute. Ellen developed her research skills as an attorney practicing civil litigation in Los Angeles. She is the author of 12 books, including the groundbreaking Web of Debt and the Public Bank Solution. Ellen's 300 plus articles are posted at ellenbrown.com. She co-hosts the radio podcast, It's Our Money, on the Progressive Radio Network. She is a fellow of the Democracy Collaborative and has degrees from UC Berkeley and UCLA School of Law. So without further ado, I think Walt will be our first presenter this evening.
Yes, and hello, and thank you everyone for really honoring us with this invitation to speak to you today. The American Ethical Union, is one of those historical, cultural stalwarts that keeps bringing us back to the fundamentals of who we are as a community by engaging the questions that we should be asking of ourselves and, of course, of our world. The big question of this conference is America all that it should be, all that it could be? And I think each of us certainly knows the answer to those questions. But by living in the question of who are we also raise the ethical responsibility question, what do we need to do to better realize our potential and to set out on wiser paths to realize them? So we're grateful that the AEU celebrates that mission and is an active partner with those of us who also share that quest. Tonight, my colleague Ellen Brown and I are going to be raising some of those related questions under the heading, Addressing the Whole Truth About America's Monetary System. Not a small task. We're going to take a small bite out of that huge topic. The whole truth, of course, doesn't lend itself to a 90-minute window, but we will endeavor to take on the most prominent aspects of how our monetary system is working or not working. And we'll talk about how the system is composed, where these elements came from, what has become of them, what evolutions are afoot that may impact our ability to create a more ethical society and world. Our general thesis tonight is that America's monetary system has morphed from its original nurturing design as an enabler of American ingenuity and industry to a financial matrix of profiteering debt that is overseen by private interests. The productive intent of this original system has been overlaid by what is called financialism, a financialist matrix designed to make money from money. And this priority typically shapes and determines the possibilities and the prospects of public policy, and the realization of public interest objectives. Our monetary system has become a dominant, supranational, global power through its conjoined network of central banks, transnational corporations, and financial entities. A virtual international cartel employs the creation of debt and extraction of interest for its expanding profiteering, but it is running out of room to continue that profit growth mandate, threatening to really, once again, sabotage our nation and the world's economy and future. But let's start with the basic question. What is money? And why money is fundamentally a tool of ethical concern. In addition to the usual notions of money being a store of value and a unit of account, we have to acknowledge that money is also a symbol of relationship and personal trust, which are two fundamental ethical components. As ethical activists, we have to acknowledge that money is the mechanism through which public policy is realized or not realized by its absence. You know, you often hear the phrase that public budgets are ethical or moral documents because they dedicate money to specific missions that express our community commitments and our priorities. Money is the means, the power that establishes and enables our civic relationships, our projects, and our potential. That fact is made brutally evident by the trillions of dollars that we willingly spend on military forays and polluting industries. And it's also demonstrated by our failure to prioritize investing our money in those people and things that are that an ethically committed society would be concerned about and prioritize. One truth about the American monetary system is that such unfortunate priorities that we hold now are allowed to prevail in the absence of the ability of the public to control these investments. The true money power of our country has been systematically and systemically co-opted by profiteering private interests of many stripes. The early Americans, of course, realized the pivotal power of creating community currencies, which enabled local industry and financial protections. And Ellen's going to tell you about that in just a moment. This is a good story, and it's really a great system that has basically gone wrong. And that too is the truth of our American monetary system. It has been transmogrified. I've been waiting all week to use that word. It's been transmogrified by a system of private control, greed, and debt. But there's encouraging hope on the horizon, and we will be discussing that later as well. So let's hear from Ellen about how we got to where we are in America's monetary regime and what we need to do to free ourselves to empower our ethical commitments to each other. Ellen?
Okay, thanks, Walt. Just share my screen, if I can figure that out. There. Okay, so two competing monetary systems have vied for dominance in the U.S. dating back to before we were even a country. They were called in the 19th century the American system and the British system. That was, oops, I'm not thinking of his name, but anyway, a senator named him that. So the American system was basically government issued, publicly issued money and credit issued through a publicly owned central bank, and credit that would be used for infrastructure and development. And in that whole plan was protective tariffs in order to protect our burgeoning little industries while they grew, because they were always under attack by the British system. And the British system was centered around the Bank of England, which was a privately owned bank, private investors that issued their own banknotes, which were promissory notes, banknotes, and lent to the government. And that actually became the national currency. And these loans, obviously, the purpose of them was not necessarily development, it was to make money for the investors. And so those are the two competing money systems that we still have going today. The possibility of using our own sovereign credit to do all those things that the country needs, infrastructure and development, versus speculative investment that is basically money making money. So the American colonists originally, it was in 1691 when the first colonial scrip was issued, and that was by the governor of Massachusetts, who was fighting a little border war, and he needed money to pay his soldiers, and he didn't have anyone to borrow it from. We didn't have gold or silver to speak of in the country, so we didn't really have our own money system. So he got the clever idea of issuing little paper receipts, which would be acknowledgement of goods or services delivered to the government. And it was supposedly an advance against future taxes, but it was a lot easier to issue these paper receipts than to pull them back in taxes, especially from these frontiersmen that were a little hard to pin down. But that worked, the receipts circulated in the community, and that became the local currency. But the problem was it was a lot easier to print than to tax. And so the colonies did tend to devalue their currencies by overprinting. So Pennsylvania came up with this quite clever solution to all that. This was Benjamin Franklin's colony. The Pennsylvania colonial government owned a bank called the Land Bank. It wasn't actually, there was no building. It was actually just a department of the government. But they printed their own money, and then they would lend it to the farmers at 5% interest, which was considered a quite good interest rate at the time. And then the government could print a little extra, which would cover the interest on the loan. So you'd have enough money out there to repay principal and interest. So you could lend the money, it would all come back as principal and interest. You could lend it again, it would all come back. So during the time that system was in place, the colonists did not have to pay taxes. The currency did not inflate, and there was no government debt. So it was a quite sustainable system. Meanwhile, in Europe, goldsmiths would keep the gold for people and issue these little paper receipts, keep it for safekeeping, and issue their own banknotes, which were promissory notes for gold. And people really preferred carrying these notes to carrying the gold. They didn't come for their gold very often. So the goldsmiths quickly discovered that they could lend 10 times as many notes as they had gold and lend them at interest. So it was quite good business for the goldsmiths. And that was actually the basis of our fractional reserve system, which is still based on a 10% capital requirement. And that became the model for the Bank of England, which was founded in 1694. So that was 3 years after the first colonial scrip was issued. And the Bank of England was private investors who lent money to the king who needed it to fund a war. So originally, the principal didn't have to be paid. It was just the interest that had to be paid. And that's pretty much what we have today. I mean, there's not much chance we're going to pay off our 30 trillion or so dollar debt, but we must pay the interest every year. It's one of those things that must get paid. So in effect, the government was renting the national currency from these private lenders. The colonists did quite well with their paper scrip until King George forbade them to issue it. And that shrank the money supply radically and triggered a depression, which was one of the major triggers for the American Revolution. And our first U.S. treasurer was Alexander Hamilton. So he set up what was called the American system. It set up the First U.S. bank. His plan was that it would be publicly owned, but they did sell shares. You could buy shares with a combination of gold and bonds, and it wound up getting pretty privatized, unfortunately. And then that bank was closed, and the second U.S. bank was opened, and Andrew Jackson shut that one down because he thought it was corrupt. And by that point, it was quite privatized. So Abraham Lincoln came into office. As soon as he got into office, he was faced with a civil war and he didn't have funding for it. And the British financiers were going to lend to him at around 30% interest, like very high interest rates. So to avoid that, he went back to the colonial system where he just issued his own paper money in the form of greenbacks. He actually doubled the money supply with these greenbacks, but it wasn't inflationary. Even Milton Friedman said in his tome on the US financial system that there was less inflation in the Civil War than there is usually there's always some inflation because of shortages and so forth. So that worked very well, not only to win the war for the North, but for development across the country, including the Transcontinental Railroad was funded through these greenbacks and tied both ends of the country together. Very good for development. But of course, Lincoln was assassinated and the greenbacks were discontinued and silver was demonetized. Before that, silver and gold together could form the capital base of a bank that would issue these banknotes. And after both those things happened, we went through another depression, and then there was a populist movement led by William Jennings Bryan, which unfortunately failed. In 1907, there was a major banking crisis, allegedly, maybe arguably triggered by J.P. Morgan. And that led to establishing the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which was modeled on the Bank of England. So today, it's composed of 12 branches, all of which are 100% owned by the private banks in their districts. So the central bank issues the currency. It's not like with the colonists or the greenbacks where the government issues the money and actually gets the benefit of the money. The central bank issues the money and can't even lend it directly to the government, but the central bank buys the government's bonds and it has to buy them on the open market. So there's always a banker middleman in there and there's an interest rate involved. So not only does the central bank create money, but our commercial banks actually create money. In fact, they create virtually all of the money supply. This was considered conspiracy theory when I started writing about it, but in 2014, the Bank of England came out and actually said in their quarterly report, they said, contrary to popular belief, banks do not act simply as intermediaries, lending out deposits the savers place with them, and nor do they multiply up central bank money to create new loans and deposits. Commercial banks create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. And in fact, they said 97% of the money supply is created that way. Now they were talking about the UK money supply, but the US money supply is pretty close to that level. So the way they do it is double entry bookkeeping. If you go to the bank to take out, let's say, a $500,000 loan for a mortgage, you will sign a mortgage, which is a promissory note. So the bank will call that an asset to itself because you're going to pay that back over time with interest. So they put that on one side of their books as an asset. And on the other side, they write the same sum as a liability to themselves. Because when you write your check to your seller, the bank is going to have to come up with liquidity in some form to transfer over to the other bank. So the bank says, well, 500 plus, 500 minus comes out to zero. They say they haven't really created anything. But if you look at it across the whole system, you can see that they do create money. Let's say you have two banks that are doing exactly the same thing. One bank creates a $500,000 loan, which becomes a check, which is deposited in the second bank. Let's say the second bank does the same thing, creates a $500,000 loan for its customer, which becomes a check, which is deposited in the first bank. So both banks have $500,000 coming in, they have 500,000 going out. Again, they say the book's balance, but in fact, there is now $1 million in the deposit accounts of these two banks that wasn't there before. And when the Fed counts the money supply, they count deposits. That is the money supply. So that is how, so the banks are creating all that digital money. You've got the Federal Reserve creating paper money. The only thing the government itself, the Treasury, can create are coins. And I did propose quite a while ago that we could solve our debt crisis with $1 trillion coins. That's something the Treasury could issue. And I still think, we both think that we could solve a lot of problems if we could go back to allowing the Treasury to just issue the money. This is basically what the Chinese do. I'll get to that in a minute. So what's wrong with this system? This is a quote that just encapsulates it. It's from Robert Hemphill, who is credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta in 1934. Of course, that was in the depths of the Depression. He said, "We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve." So private bankers determine where the money goes. Legally, they own the deposits. It's just like when you take out a loan, you can do whatever you want with that money. The bank doesn't tell you what to do with it. You can speculate with it, or so it's the same with the bank. When they take your deposit, they've borrowed it from you, and they can lend, they can gamble with it, speculate with it. They can lend to their cronies and not to other people. They determine who gets the loans and the terms. They can refuse to lend, and they can charge quite high fees and interest for state and local governments. So that's obviously a problem for governments. Then there's a mathematical problem. So banks create the principal, but they don't create the interest. And over the course of a 30-year mortgage or a 30-year infrastructure project, you're going to pay as much or even more in interest as in principal. So where is that interest going to come from? Over the whole system, it can only come from more debt. So you can see from this chart that debt always grows faster than the money supply. And that's why the money supply grows at interest. So the interest has to come from somewhere. It's basically a pyramid scheme. You have to get more and more debtors in at the bottom in order to support the 1% or the lenders at the top. And as we know, pyramid schemes invariably aren't sustainable, they crash. So what we wind up with is what's called the business cycle, euphemistically, as if it were the weather or something that just, was a law of nature, where the debt expands and expands until the debtors can't support it anymore, and then it collapses. But inevitably, there will be some people who have money when the thing collapses. And in fact, typically there are insiders who know it's going to collapse. And that definitely happened in the 1930s, for example. So they can buy up all the assets cheaply from all the mortgages that get foreclosed on, or the stocks that the stock market crashes. They can snatch up the stocks cheaply, et cetera. So they wind up richer. Inevitably, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This is a chart just in the last 20 years or 22 years. You can see that the upper 1% are way outpacing anyone else in terms of growth. The average household wealth of the upper 1% is $33 million. This whole chart is only the upper 50%, because the lower 50% doesn't even show on the chart. They have so little increase in wealth in that 21 years, relatively 22 years. And then there is the problem for state and local, I can't even see the top of my thing, but anyway, state and local governments, they have to borrow by issuing bonds. Unlike the federal government, which at least can borrow pretty cheaply, state and local governments issue bonds at 3 or 4 or 5%, depending on what the bond is for, over 30 years. Again, it's just like a mortgage. and they wind up paying as much in interest as in principal. But typically when you vote for one of these bond issues, they only tell you what the principal is. They don't tell you what you're going to pay in interest. So here, these are just two California examples. I'm from California. So where the bill in the end was double what the voters were told, double what principal was because of interest. So banks, unlike local governments, have perks that we don't get. In March of 2020, during the beginning of the shutdowns, the Federal Reserve came out with new rules for the banks where any bank in good standing can now borrow from the Federal Reserve. They still kept these rules, can borrow from the Federal Reserve at 0.25%. So they're getting this money almost for free. And there's no strings attached to the money. They can still lend it. They can lend on your credit card at 20%. They can lend to whomever they want. They can speculate, et cetera. And another advantage of being a bank, most state and local governments have revolving funds, like some sort of fund where they lend for infrastructure, et cetera. California has what's called the Infrastructure and Development Bank, but it's not really a bank. It's really just a fund. It's got $300 million in it last time I looked, and that was the capital base. So they lend out $300 million at 3%, and they make 3% over the year. It comes back and they lend it out again. If you're a bank, you could use that $300 million for capital, and on the fractional reserve system, which we still basically have, the 10-to-1 system, you only need 1/10 of your assets in the form of capital. So they could be making $3 billion in loans and let's say they were still at 3%, that would be 30% less costs, of course. But anyway, you could make a lot more money and you could make a lot more loans, which that type of loan is in huge demand. The California Infrastructure and Development Bank there's 20 times the demand as they have available funds. So how can we compete with the banks, form our own banks? That's our Public Banking Institute solution. This is not a new idea. There are globally 25% of banking assets are publicly owned. And China is probably the biggest and the most developed. So 80% of Chinese banking assets are owned by the government. So for example, they built 12,000 miles of high-speed rail in a decade, and we haven't even gotten our project going here in California because we can't find the money for it. So how did the Chinese do it? They borrowed from their own infrastructure development bank. It doesn't really even matter what the interest rate is because they own the bank, so they're going to get the money back. So they borrow, they build the thing, the fees from the train pay back the loan, and totally sustainable. It's the same model that was used by Roosevelt and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which I don't think I've gotten to yet, but I will. And then Germany has another sort of stellar public banking model. Half of German banking assets are in the public sector. These are largely the Sparkassen banks, which every little community has. One thing they've done recently is they're transforming their economy to renewables. And this was largely the public banks that funded that transformation, particularly KfW, which is a huge development bank. In the U.S., we have one only state-owned bank. We also have a territorial bank and Bank of America Samoa that was founded, I think, 2 years ago. But when I started writing about the Bank of North Dakota in late 2008, because I knew they were the only state that had their own bank. So I was watching it, and it turned out it was the only state that never went in the red. It was always in the black. It had the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest default rate, and the most banks per capita. And in 2014, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that said that the Bank of North Dakota is actually more profitable than Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. Now, how is that even possible? I mean, according to the Bank of North Dakota president, they're not even trying to make a profit. That's not their goal. Their mandate is to serve their public community. But their secret is basically they cut out the middleman. So they don't have private shareholders. They don't pay bonuses, fees, or commissions. They don't have high paid executives, and they don't really have to advertise. They've got a massive deposit base. By law, all the state's revenues are deposited in the bank. They don't have to advertise for customers. Their customers are essentially the local banks. They're really a banker's bank. So it's the local bank that deals with the customers and has the branches, et cetera. And the Bank of North Dakota just steps in and helps with liquidity and capitalization and regulations, that sort of thing. So they can make quite low interest loans, and they pass those savings on to the community. Public banks in general are good in crises. They lend counter-cyclically, and they are safer, and they respond more quickly. So this chart is from the 2008-2009 crisis, but the private banks are on the left and the public banks are on the right. You can see the public banks, while the private banks were drawing in their loans, they're afraid to lend. The public banks are out there making more loans than ever, increasing their lending. In the last year, in the shutdowns, North Dakota distributed unemployment benefits through the Bank of North Dakota and their local banks 10 times faster than the lowest state. And small businesses in North Dakota secured more payroll protection program funds per worker than in any other state. We had a national model that was similar to what the Chinese do. During the Great Depression, Roosevelt tried to get the Federal Reserve banks to lend directly to businesses, but he couldn't get that passed. So instead, he used the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a financial institution set up by the previous President Hoover. And so they started out with minimal capitalization, $500 million. And over the next 25 years, they loaned or invested over $40 billion, rebuilt the country, and funded the U.S. participation in World War II. And for all that, turned a profit for the government. So how did they do it? They're basically they made what were called self-funding loans. These are loans to businesses that can pay the money back. So say electric companies or dams that would issue electricity and the fees would pay the loan back, or farmers that could pay the loan back from their proceeds. So they're basically issuing credit for development, and the proceeds of the development pay the loan back. And the loans are obviously at low interest. We have a similar bill on right now that we say we, but anyway, the U.S., the National Infrastructure Bank Group has a bill on the National Infrastructure Bank bill. It was introduced in May of this year, but it was a remake of a bill introduced last year. It would, according to, well, apparently we need $5 trillion in infrastructure. And what the Treasury or what Congress is proposing to fund is not nearly enough. So this bank could fund $5 trillion in infrastructure, create 25 million new jobs, and still turn a profit for the government. And it's on the same Reconstruction Finance Corporation model, where they're basically just issuing credit and using it for self-funding loans that can pay the loans back. And the borrowers would be state and local governments building infrastructure. We also, from 1911 to 1967, had a quite popular postal banking system, particularly during the Great Depression. It was very popular. People just were afraid of the private banks that were going bankrupt, so they pulled their money out and they would put it in the postal bank, which was guaranteed by the government, of course. The problem was that, I mean, what should have happened, what I would have liked to see happen, was that we could have, if Roosevelt had supported that, or if Congress had developed that, we could have a national public banking system right now, and through our post offices, which already have the infrastructure there. But instead, what Congress did was FDIC insurance. So basically, we guaranteed the deposits of private banks, our individual deposits in private banks. So public-private partnership, where once again, as we've seen way too much now, the government bailed out the private banks and it was we, the taxpayers, that paid for the bailout. but it did get the banks back on their feet, and eventually the postal banking system was terminated. But that too, there's a postal bank bill that was introduced last fall. The basic goal is to service the unbanked and underbanked, which is a major problem. I guess 25% of the population is unbanked or underbanked. So, and the postal banks could turn a profit for the post office and help them with their current debt situation. And then there's one other bill that we like right now that's called the Public Banking Bill. And it's a federal bill, and it would just facilitate setting up state and local public banks. And that's what Public Banking Institute is all about, state and local public banks. So this is just a map of progress of late. So in just this year, 17 new public banking bills have been introduced in 8 states. 30 of the 50 states have proposed public banking bills over the last decade or so. And over 50 organizations are promoting public banks. So we have a lot of small groups that are working on this project. And for more information, we have a lot of research on publicbankinginstitute.org, and I've written hundreds of articles on my own website, which is ellenbrown.com. Thank you very much.
All right, Ellen, thank you. Thank you so much. She's done a really great job in laying out some of the ways in which our monetary system certainly was intended to function, and also in how it's morphed into something quite different. I just want to take a couple of minutes here to put some of these things in another perspective, so that you can see that not only is the banking system deformed from what it was, but what it's doing to our economy and to our culture and to our communities is another component. So recapping some of those items here, America's financial monetary system, of course, incorporates a bunch of key players, namely the all-important common sovereign currency, which is our true treasury, our central banking system, which of course regulates a private banking structure and network, and of course the emerging impact and increasing role of corporate-controlled payment and financial networks, most of which live on Wall Street. As Ellen has described, this issuance of credit has been one of those community relational institutions that typically provided, used to be provided by community banks and credit unions. But they've been key to providing local credit for local businesses to fund growth and services and so forth. But the trend, as you may know, toward financial institution consolidation has occurred over the last 10 years, shrinking the number of banks by about 2/3, meaning that when mergers and acquisitions, which are hot again this year, can take these little banks, these little local banks off the streets, that means that people, small business people, have to go to the big banks to get money. And what they do is they don't run into real people who know them or understand the community or even have a commitment to the local community. What they run into is someone who sits at the desk and operates a computer and runs your data through an algorithm. So the little guy and gal on Main Street has to rely instead on expensive sources of capital, perhaps like credit card debt or friends or something. So the consolidation of big banks that are interested primarily in maximizing the profits are certainly less interested in making local businesses survive. These loans, local businesses carry a little bit more risk, or maybe a lot more risk in some cases. Small businesses do fail. And they have lower profit margins for the banks. The big banks can make more money with less effort and potentially less risk by making large loans to corporate or well-heeled private entities. So once again, the result is in our monetary system, Main Street has been diminished with fewer affordable credit resources, and consequently, a diminished local economic prospect. In fact, one of the primary missions that are cited most often by public banking initiatives around the country is the need to provide affordable credit to support enabling and expanding small and minority businesses, which are the primary providers of employment. They help build community economic stability, and the world over, public banks have shown themselves to be the greatest stabilizers of local economies through their public interest missions. Another aspect of local aspect of the monetary system is how we deflect substantially local substantial tax dollars to Wall Street interests. Things like the banks, the global banks, the bond markets, hedge funds, private equity firms. As Ellen said, we're spending $160 billion every year out of our communities, cities, counties, states, to pay for interest, and probably doesn't even include fees. And that's only part of the way in which the current monetary system extracts and exploits the Main Street interests and Main Street equity. So we have a structural dependency on Wall Street, which puts states and municipal authorities at a great disadvantage, since they really don't typically use their collective categorical financial strength to negotiate lower rates. I mean, civil authorities really aren't really financial wizards for the most part. They're not necessarily up to speed with what's going down with Wall Street stratagems and financial devices. You'll recall not too many years ago, maybe you will, but not too many years ago, the cities of Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Baltimore, and Birmingham, many others, paid billions of dollars in interest rate swaps, and a scheme that has really wound up still in court for some deceptive advertising on the part of Wall Street. But those dollars went out as a priority by the local governments. So Los Angeles didn't spend more on these swaps than they spent on fixing their roads. And Philadelphia closed 20 schools. Chicago, same sort of thing, devastating. Why? Because they are so beholden to Wall Street and to the role that Wall Street plays in and also the relationships, by the way, in the back room between some of the politicians and Wall Street interests. All of that is, really colors the way this monetary system is currently devised. Now, as Ellen also pointed out, this is a sweetheart deal for them. And a bad deal for the public. We're trying to pay for infrastructure. Well, we have to pay twice as much. And she described that very well. If we had our own bank, we'd be able to use the capital that we might otherwise send to Wall Street with our sending our tax money to Wall Street, use that as capital in our own bank, and then leverage that to make some real serious investments in our own neighborhoods.
I would.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I would just add, we tend to blame Wall Street, and think they're crooks. And some Wall Street banks have actually been caught in felonies. I mean, they are crooks to some extent, but it's also a flaw in the system. I mean, their mandate is to make money for their shareholders. And they're always worried about, day to day, they watch their, things go up. Anyway, they're always worried about that bottom line for their investors. And a public bank has just a totally different mandate. I mean, we have to change the system. You can't expect people to become honest or not to want as much money as they can make. We have a system that's based on making as much money as you can, and everybody will do it unless we restructure it.
Yeah, and that is the point, that because the public does not have a say in who gets the credit, our system of private issuance of credit has undermined a lot of potential. A lot of communities of color, for example, failing to invest in these neighborhoods is a simple function of private banks not wanting to risk their capital or their assets, but also because there have been other sort of systemic exclusions that discriminate against these marketplaces, and it has been that way for generations. So it presumes a kind of an unethical right to discriminate for the sake of protecting their profits. which undermines public interest and our prospects. So there are lots of ways in which this discrimination is executed. But back on the macro level, our financialized monetary system, and by financialized, again, that means that, people are making money off of their money. That's, of course, the stock market. That's the rentier society. That's people who are investing and getting the payback. Well, the vast majority of Americans are principally, as a function of that, we're principally a nation of debtors, who move through our adopted lifestyles, if you will, with borrowed money. But the result is this enormous amount of household debt. I mean, by the end of 2020, household debt climbed to $14.6 trillion. It's the highest ever. 1.7 trillion of that is student debt, about 45 million students. It's even more than is carried in credit card debt, which is $700 billion. So when you're talking about a system, a monetary system of money and finance, we have to remember that someone's debt, as Ellen sort of intimated, is another person's asset. And it's, of course, the primary instrument for profiteering. Obviously, if you can borrow money cheaply and invest in some commodity and sell it for more, well, that's the typical capitalist principle of creating profit. But in the past several years, as evidenced by how financialization has matured, American corporations have been able to borrow money cheaply to buy back their stock, and they've used those share values to pay bigger amounts to CEOs and stockholders. Now, kind of shockingly, one source of this cheap money has been our central bank, if you want to call it ours. It's the Federal Reserve, as Ellen pointed out. Their purpose is supposedly to keep employment up and inflation stable, but instead they've been collaborating with their corporate and banking clients and commanded corporate and financial markets to boost returns by offering cheap money, not for productive generation of products and services, but really, again, to be able to maximize profits quickly, and in some cases to just take down corporations and companies and sell them out so that they would be able to benefit the stockholders. I noticed our friend and economist Michael Hudson was talking with Paul Jay the other day on the analysis.news, where he talked about the Federal Reserve. And just so that we're all clear, let me quote what Michael said. The Federal Reserve's job, he says, is to make sure that the economy is run for the banking system and for the bondholders, rather than having the banking system and bond markets run for the economy. So we're living in an upside down economy where everything is being run in order to sustain the bondholders and the banks. And the problem with this is that the mortgage debts, the student loan debts, the personal debts, the car loan debts, they're growing at an exponentially high rate, while the economy isn't growing at a high rate. All of the economy's growth since 2008, as Ellen's chart showed, has been only for the top 5% of the population. For 95% of the population since 2008, the GDP has actually shrunk. Well, that's what Michael's comment was about the financialized economy. By the way, he did this wonderful book not too long ago called Killing the Host, in which he describes how this predatory action of sucking all of the lifeblood and the wealth out of the host, which is us, is a primary driver in the national monetary system, replacing productivity. So the all-consuming influence of this financialization schema is undermining our democratic power, and I think that's a bottom line we want you to take away. It relegates the real power and potential of our monetary system to an increasingly small, vastly richer group of individuals. You'll recall that this isn't the first time that this system has shown up on the world. What used to be called feudalism. Oligarchs owned the property, laborers worked, paid their way, but they didn't acquire any equity for their labors. Well, here we are. America's monetary system, once again, returning to serve a rentier economy controlled by emerging monopolies that exercise this outsized, undemocratic influence on our political institutions, and they crowd out public interest in the process. You know, the haves have more, the have-nots are losing ground at really a frightening pace. And there would appear to be no end in sight, really no power big enough to overtake the momentum of the behemoth Wall Street momentum speculative interests, all right? So in wrapping up here, the irony is that those who are not living at some level of aspiration, all of this seems quite normal. You know, the parasitic nature of our financialized Wall Street serving economy has succeeded in producing devilishly distracting benefits which tend to overshadow the deteriorating economic status of our fellow citizens. So whether we assess this through a look at our infrastructures, our education, our health, our public safety, shared community assets, the public interest is not the leading concern of the real powers that are behind our monetary system. You may recall a Princeton study of a few years back that when they looked at the past 40 years in public policy, they saw that there was no statistically significant indicator that the expressed will of the people, call it public interest if you will, got reflected in public policy. Rather, the legislative policies more frequently represented the moneyed interests that were with lobbies in Congress. All right, so those are some of the, unfortunately, some of the hard truths of the American monetary system. I think that we would need to consider how we are going to muster our energies as a democratic society to do perhaps what the colonists did back in the 18th century and find a way to rid ourselves of this exploitative system of control. Perhaps we start with the Federal Reserve, perhaps we start with the Public Banking Act, but really, it's been done before. God help us to do it again, I would say. And with that, let's open it up to your questions or any comments you'd care to make, Ellen.
Well, it does strike me too. I'll say one thing in defense of the Federal Reserve, something I've just been reading about lately. You know, there's this, the Great Reset, which is a push for globalization. So the U.S. would no longer be the reserve currency, would probably be the IMF's SDRs, you know, anyway. So the Federal Reserve is actually the last holdout against this system, which is kind of good. You know, they're defending our I'm sure they're defending their banking system, and that's the whole goal. But still, there is something to be, you know, I think all these players, I shouldn't say all, I'm sure there are crooks in the system, but people are just playing their roles in the system. You know, you look at any of these big players and you could relate in a way. I mean, you wouldn't want to be in their position really, because they have such heavy decisions to make, but they're, you know, they play the hand they're dealt. In other words, I don't know that they're, well, I just hesitate to villainize anyone. It's the system. We need to,
Yes.
could transform the system. And if we did transform it, it's like a monopoly game. If you set the rules right, then you've got a fair game. And right now, the way the rules are laid out, it's not a fair game.
And I wanted to, and that was of course my point. We wanted to emphasize how it's working, not for the people, but because of the rule, because of the way it's set up. Now, one of the positive and promising prospects Ellen touched on, which is the Public Banking Act, which would reform the Fed and nurture and enable public banking and support capitalization of it and have incubators for them and so forth, and start to build sort of a parallel federal reserve banking service and institution to support democratizing our monetary system. All right, what do you think about questions? Anybody have any questions?
Randy?
You're muted, Randy.
Yeah, you're muted.
Do you think that any of the populist initiatives at the state level have a chance of succeeding? I mean, pulling this off at a national level, if what Wall Street wants, Wall Street gets, and certainly Wall Street doesn't want reform that isn't in their interest. So do you think the state level is the place for this to start to happen, or do you think that there are some opportunities to have reform made at a national level?
Yeah, we have some very good state bank bills on right now. Well, or Citibank. San Francisco has a very good bill. Massachusetts has a very good bill. New Jersey has potential. Well, could talk about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, I think these things take time. You know, people tell me that when I was complaining about how long this takes, somebody said, well, you know, it took 30 years for the suffragettes to get the vote for women, which seems like an easier sell than setting up a public bank, because 50% of the population are women. But anyway.
Well, I would add to that, Randy, that the initiatives that are going on at the state level, we have kind of a household belief that once a public bank at the state level gets produced, or even at the municipal level, that there will be a domino effect. Part of it is because there is such an almost unchallengeable logic to keeping your money at home to invest in your own community, complemented by this extraordinary amount of extraction of public tax dollars at a time when there's such a need for local investment and state investment. So let's just take a look for just a minute at some of the state initiatives. The one in Massachusetts has now been endorsed by one of the largest nonprofit groups, and the Black Business Council of the state has strong legislative support. In New York, there are a couple of bills that are supported for a state bank there. One that would do what California did last year, and this was through their assembly. They codified public banks in that state. So municipalities can now create municipal banks, their own municipal public banks, with the approval and with the support and with the oversight of the California government. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, San Diego, Northern California are all on the verge. Washington has been working on it for years, the state of Washington for a lot of years, Oregon, New Mexico. These are all sort of stultified efforts. New Jersey has a governor that's very interested in having a bank, and it's been a tough act to pull off, but there's good momentum there as well. Philadelphia has done an interesting thing, and it apparently has complete support of the Philadelphia City Council, which is to create a public banking authority without having to go through the hurdles of getting FDIC approval and on a bank charter. So Philadelphia's creative approach there may actually be one of the first examples of a public bank to be realized. I will say something else to kind of build this state. One of the things we've learned in the last decade, don't look now, Ellen, is that starting a bank is hard work. It's a very heavy lift for a variety of reasons. There is, of course, the primary and obvious reason that the banking industry does not want competition of any sort, let alone the public getting into its lunchbox. So we have the banking associations in all of the places that we are that are basically against it, except for the fact that in the state of North Dakota, that has its own public bank, the Community Banks Association loves their public bank. They do more business and are more profitable than any other such banks in the country, because they have a partner in a public bank, a partnership relationship where their bankers, they have a banker's bank in their public bank. So banks get to benefit from that. But, you know, I won't get too carried away, but I just want to say one more thing about San Francisco and also perhaps New Jersey. That staging the process of creating a public bank through an interim facility is gaining new traction and new momentum. The idea of creating a municipal finance authority or municipal finance corporation is basically a way for a municipality to not have to go right through the chartering process, but to immediately start lending into the targeted objectives of the bank, the mission of the bank, and get that going for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And in the process, building a portfolio, building the organizational strength, and then going for the full bank charter later on.
Carolyn, and then Stan, and then Diane. Carolyn?
I'm kind of afraid to ask because it's a lot of this is really sort of over my head. I get the point that I feel like banks are generally a criminal enterprise. And so I've done what I could to take money out of banks and moved over to the credit union. I thought that was a more ethical kind of idea. But it sounds as if, how do we know, what can we do with our money that is ethical? Investing in municipal bonds may not be such a good thing after all. I'm not really sure. I know that you're here to talk about changing the system, but with the system we have, how can we behave ethically or responsibly with our money?
Go ahead.
Okay. Interesting question. I don't think banks are unethical. Certainly there are some that have operated that way, and and 5 of them are on Wall Street, or some of the primary banks in the Federal Reserve. However, banking as an institution is a very important, valuable service. Credit, it really, as Ellen has pointed out, the genius of money and of credit is very obvious, but we need somebody who can professionally manage it. Banks are risky. Banking can be very risky. But how they deploy their money is really up to the banker. Now, from the standpoint of the community, where we put our money as community money, Carolyn, I think is really a function of the local, I want to say bureaucrats, but really the elected officials, the people who make public policy, who draft the budgets. Where they get the money to build the bridge is kind of where the intersection where public banking can get into the conversation. Most banks most municipalities and states don't have enough money to really pursue all of the infrastructure needs they need. So they go to the bond market. And the bond market then, gathers a bunch of investors together and offers it as is okay. And we're certainly not suggesting that we would be replacing that. Certainly not initially, because it takes a fair amount of equity and capital firepower to do that. But the bond market would certainly be, if it had to be in competition with a public bank that could make that bond cheaper, or perhaps the public bank would join in it, then the public can benefit interimly or transitionally to be able to start to change the way the monetary dynamic flows for public interest in our governments.
Yeah, and our particular interest is in what we do with our public monies, not our private monies. A credit union obviously is a very, a good option for your private money, but a city like Los Angeles can't put its money in a credit union. They have limits on how much they can take, what they can do with it. And the system we have now, the cities and states are putting their money in Wall Street banks, which then leverage that money into credit for their cronies or for their own purposes. Whereas if we could put that money in our own bank, we could leverage it in the same way, make 10 times as much credit as we have actual capital in the bank, and use it for public purposes. And then it's all up to your charter. You've got to put in the charter the what you want this money to be used for, or what parameters you want to put around it. We just saw, there was a good presentation yesterday by one of our board members, Michael Brennan, in the Democracy Collaborative, on a model for an LA public bank that that's their particular focus, their concern is how do you protect the public interest and use this money for what the people, actually serve the people.
And two things more, if I may, Carolyn. One is that one obvious thing that we forgot is that the way we envision these public banks is that they are not in competition with local retail banks, that these are not retail institutions. They're not really vying for home loans and car loans and so forth. That's not what we want to get into. And in fact, the architecture that we envision for public banking is that the public bank will reinforce those local lenders who already know the neighborhoods and are already invested in there. We want local community banks to thrive as well as credit unions. So I think that's a very important point, such an obvious one that we often forget to mention it. The other thing I want to say,
New Mexico, the head of the credit union group, whatever they're called, was strongly in favor of a New Mexico public bank for the same reason, that it would be working with the local banks. And the Bank of North Dakota has right in their charter that they can't compete with the local banks. So they support the local banks.
and Carolyn, I just want to speak to one more thing that you suggested. And really, how do we take ethical action to change the monetary system that is not functioning in our interests? And I want to just say that I think the public banking movement represents exactly that kind of power shifting that the people are doing. What has driven, beside the financial benefits of having your own bank, but what has driven many of the initiatives around the country is that the people didn't want their money going into Wells Fargo and Bank of America and Chase that were investing in private prisons and fossil fuels and so forth and so on. They wanted to have a bank that would invest in things like small, medium enterprises, affordable housing, yada, yada, yada. I mean, the whole long list of public policies that we have yet to fund because we do not have the money. So we're in this evolutionary moment. And I think the public banking movement is one of many, but I think a principal one because of how important money is for our policy interests to move forward.
I see we have two hands up. First was Stan and then Diane. Stan?
I'm just wondering what you think of cryptocurrency. It seems to me it has the potential to disrupt the banking system since it takes currency out of their control.
Well, there's pluses and minuses on cryptocurrency. I have a good friend who just lost her one Bitcoin worth $38,000 because she got hacked. And the thing is, at least I had a small claim once, $1,000, and I, submitted my claim to the bank credit department, whatever. And some individual, some nice woman who I think of as a jury of our peers, here's this woman went over all my paperwork. I submitted all this paperwork to prove that, that I didn't owe this $1,000. And she agreed with me. Now my friend has no one in I don't know if it was Coinbase or I'm not sure which exchange she was using, but they won't answer her calls. There's no one there to deal with consumer issues. There's a lot to be said for a stable government-backed sort of system, even though it's corrupt. That's why we want to fix the government system, because we want one that's stable and secure and that you're not going to get hacked.
And I would add, Stan, that cryptocurrencies are, they're speculative investments, and they do not have the backing of the full faith and credit of a government. So you're always working within a realm of almost like of a commodity. And while there's a lot of rage and a lot of enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies, I think thousands of them at this point, they have varying levels of utility. They don't lend themselves as really being alternative currencies. They're alternative markets in which currency or trades are made, but they're certainly not secure, nor are in the sense that they do not have the full faith and credit of a government behind them. Now, I would say there is in afoot around internationally is the central bank digital currency. It's not the same thing, but the idea that digital central bank currencies will be, a new iteration of technology and the sovereign currency that we'll be using.
Yeah, we have often tried to figure out, we haven't really worked it out, but it would be ideal. You have all these little communities forming. Many people are saying that the solution to our current problems is go local, we don't know what's coming. We could have food shortages, etc. I mean, I live in the big city, so there's no hope for me, but just as a theoretical thing, that it would be cool if cities, states could issue their own currency, or a local community could certainly, I mean, they obviously have community currencies, but digitizing them makes it a lot simpler. And they're trade associations that are all digital, and that seems to work out very well. I mean, there's a lot of potential for it, but it wouldn't work for a national currency. And that's what we're kind of all about, is how to reform the national system, or at least the state or the public government system.
Yeah. Now, there are things called stable coins, which, as you know, are basically one for one exchange with the local currency. So I think there's some, maybe a very varietal difference with that. But I want to support Ellen's point that I think we are at a time when our digital capabilities would enable us to create localized currencies for localized interest needs and so forth. And of course, that's not anything new. They're all over the world. The VIR is one such example in Sweden, but there are many all over the world. Baltimore had the B dollars, which was a network of merchants within a certain realm. Philadelphia was, what was it? The Ithaca dollar, with our Philadelphia friend who started that. Anyway, so there are examples of that, and I think there's utility to it as well, Stan.
That's certainly the up and coming thing. I mean, it's not
Thank you.
and cryptocurrencies are backed by different things. I'm in California, where marijuana and hemp are legal, and I was just at a hemp group that we're talking about, they're having funding problems. So you could have a cryptocurrency that's backed by your product, and that's what it is it's a coin that you can trade in for your product. So within that group, the crypto would work very well. And they're excited about the whole idea of a crypto that's for their specific group.
And if I may, I'd make one more small little thing here. The economist Hyman Minsky is noted for saying anyone can make money. Can make money. The trick is to get it accepted. So if I give you a branch, and I say, this is worth something, well, if you take it, that's great.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. If you walked into the grocery store and tried to pay with your own IOU, the store wouldn't take it. That's the reason we need banks, because you can take your IOU to the bank and the bank will take it. They know where to find you. You're going to put up some collateral, probably your house, and and you're going to pay them some interest. So that's what it's really we say that banks create money, but really you yourself create the money in partnership with the bank, because you've got the bank to back you up, or ideally you've got the state to back you up with full faith and credit of the state or the local, the national government.
Diane?
Well, listening to everybody, I do have a question, but now I have an anecdote. My son in 5th grade had this terrific teacher who created his own cash. So you would, in that classroom, you had Conway cash, which had value and meaning, and it worked within that little community. So that's cool. That's the anecdote. My thought, what came to mind talking about public banking, I'm thinking about people who work in the public sector, public service jobs, policemen, firemen, teachers, and they're funding their pensions are in the Wall Street. And so I'm wondering how the pension funds for both government and different nonprofit healthcare organizations are weighing in on this, if anything.
Well, if I may, I was one of the things I was going to include in my list of financial entities, but or ways in which Wall Street is using the public's resources. Pension funds are, I think, an emerging focus on how much of a giveaway they are for pension fund managers. And their lack, well, they're now being called into account to divest from fossil fuels or other things. And I think in New Jersey, there's been a divestment regard there, but at least they're investing in things that are like green energy. What we would say is that the pension funds of any given area would make excellent sources of capital for local investment in a bank or capitalization for public banks, at least some of them, even a small portion. These funds have like billions and tens of billions of dollars, which, I'll give you an example. In New Jersey, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they were managing their own pension fund at a cost of in-house in the government, $10 million was their expense. Now in 2020, they're spending close to $700 million in fees and bonuses to pension fund managers who are not returning much or are not keeping up with the market by any stretch of the imagination. So yes, it is an area of great concern, of potential for the public to get kind of smarter about what their pension funds are doing and how they could be much more useful. Yeah.
I think we may have time for one or two more questions. Call-in user number one. If you can identify yourself and go ahead and ask a question.
Yes, thank you so very much. This is Zabby. I do a radio show at Stony Brook University, A Woman's Perspective on Politics, and I do public access television, and I've been talking about public banking for a long, long time. I have actually on a website, I have websites too, and I have Ellen Brown linked to her information. And Walter, if I could get the spelling of your last name and what your last name is, and I'd like to know how to contact you.
Okay,
it's possible. And also, I would like to say that I don't want to, I think there may be about 20 or 25 or so, I don't know how many people attending, but I wouldn't want anybody to think that it's over anybody's heads. Like Carolyn, I don't think it's over your head at all. And Diane, it sounded like you're really thinking on it very well, because indeed, pensions can be a source of capitalization for a public bank. And I wanted to know what the numbers for the federal number, the House bill and the Senate bill, what are the numbers? You gave two bills that you have nationally so that we can make our calls and support those. And then for New York, I'm in New York, and I'm very interested, Walter, in your Philadelphia bill, which is indeed very creative, as you said, establishing a municipal financial authority, a public banking authority, so that people who wanted to start a bank didn't have to go through the bureaucracy of people who don't really want you to start the bank. And so that is very innovative, and I'd like to get a copy of it. And I'm a senior citizen, and I do not have a computer. As you can see, I'm calling by phone. I don't have an email. So I'd have to do it by phone, and if you could give permission for Elle to give me your phone number, Walter, that would be great, because I'd like to have you on my radio show as well. I can, you can call in and everything. And so, yes, and I'd like to get I don't know the numbers of the bills for New York, because this is wonderful. I didn't know that New York was also trying to create an authority as well here, and that would be a wonderful thing to know what the numbers are to support these bills. And I think it would be neat to have the Ethical Culture Society get a committee together to study this, because it's not really that difficult. You can, and the Bank of North Dakota, by the way, gets its money from its industries, its mining industries and all of the different industries, and it supports those industries. It supports the students, their students, and that's what it does. And people deposit their money, the public of the whole North Dakota public, they deposit their deposits in the public bank. You see, and the pensions could be also put into the public banks to capitalize it and not make it such a hard job to start the bank, because I have on one of my websites the easiest way to rob a bank is to own one.
Oh yeah,
There's a book entitled
that's
that.
Bill Black's book. It's good. Well, listen, I don't know your name.
My name is Zabby. It's spelled Z
Abby,
for Zorro, A for Apple, B for brilliant, and Y for yes. Zabby.
That's great. That's wonderful. Abby, you say you're not online at all?
No.
Do you, because the easiest way to get to me, and I'd certainly be able to share everything, all the other stuff you want, would be to simply go to Walt at publicbankinginstitute.org. So if you can get to a computer, we can open up a more useful conversation there.
We have all those bills, and all the information you're asking is on the publicbankinginstitute.org website.
And Abby, do I understand?
And may I just say, it's not Abby. It's put a Z for Zorro in front of the word Abby.
Okay.
Zabby.
So Zabby, I just want to say I'm jealous that you are in proximity to Stephanie Kelton at Stony Brook.
Yes, I spoke about her on my last radio show and the one before that as well. The myth of the idea of the deficit myth, of course.
Myth. It's
absolutely.
Everybody
so,
should read.
Yeah, I would like to be able to correspond with you on the phone, though, if possible, and then to have you on my show, because I liked how you laid this out very much. So, Walter,
Okay. Well,
what is your last name anyway?
McRee, MC capital R, double E.
And give me the because I can go to the library and get a computer, get on a computer. But right now, since I'm a senior citizen, I'm not going because of the COVID and the threat now of this other strain. And so I'm not planning to be going soon. And so that's why I'd like to get on this right away and support the national. I think that's a wonderful idea, doing it nationally, because and by the way, I would suggest that you get some kind of a public access television production. You can do an hour or 2 hours, and you need to submit that throughout the United States.
Well, we actually have one of those, Zabby. So,
well, I would like you to send one to me.
Zabby, I think we need to move on. We have one more question.
Okay, could I just get that website name, Walt? It's WALT. Could you go slower?
Well, that would be my email address, Zabby, Walt at publicbankinginstitute.org. And if you go to the publicbankinginstitute.org website, you'll get all the information that you just requested, except my phone number.
Okay, can we have one last question?
Thank you.
Shirley, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think in Texas, we could use several bullet trains like they have in China.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how we'd find out about, what's happening in Texas, toward this effort. And also just on a national level, is Biden doing anything? Is there anything he can do as president to, head us in that direction?
In Texas, we have some young people who are interested, but I don't think we have a bill going at the moment, do we? Well,
there's somebody in Houston and there's somebody in Austin that we're aware of, and there are probably a couple more. But, I would just say that if you'd like to find out more and also, continue the discussion, the Public Banking Institute holds monthly conference calls, Zoom conference calls. You can phone in if you're savvy, but you can also join us online. They're it's called the Coalition Calls, second Friday of every month, resuming in September, and it's at noon Eastern. So, and we talk for an hour and a half about public banking, what's going on in the local area and your areas and so forth, so on. So we're able to, really broaden the conversation in that way.
So I
Really, well, again, just drop either Ellen or me, Ellen at Public Banking Institute or Walt at publicbankinginstitute.org. We'll be happy to respond to you with whatever we can help you with.
I'd like to thank our presenters for a really fascinating discussion. I suspect that not everyone on this Zoom meeting has really heard much about public banking prior to this. In Philly, we were lucky because that bill was brought to City Council, so we were a little keyed up about it going into this workshop. And please note in the chat that Carolyn has put in a link for our response form. So please let us know, by filling out that form, how we did tonight. And with that, I'd like to thank Ellen and Walt and also our host, Carolyn, and all of our co-hosts for making this possible. Very much appreciated.
And thank you from us too. We're delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
Meeting you on good talking.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Good night.